2018. How does a nation born to a continent which scientists claim is a cradle of humankind find themselves presented as a nation without a food history? We grapple with the question, who are the custodians of our food? Indigenous crafts, animals, landscape, and modern architecture is easy to identify according to the various cultures, but food remains a puzzle. It attests to the loss of indigenous food and farming methods which plague the nation today. It also robs the younger generation of a wealthy food culture and knowledge. Climate change is currently challenging us on the crops that we choose to grow. Logic would tell us that crops that are indigenous to the landscape would far better fare with climate change. But we look beyond this. Now, nations the world over are going back to the methods of old. They are working on zero food waste and celebrating indigenous crops. But where are we on this? You may just appreciate my journey. What makes a young lady at the dawn of affirmative action measures designed to help remove the barriers that curbed her from climbing up the corporate ladder in South Africa walk away from that? At the time, it bothered me that wherever we went around the country, the restaurant scene did not represent the indigenous diversity in food or the multicultural heritage that we have in our country. This led me to start looking into why the landscape looked this way. I then decided I would leave this lucrative career, and I walked into one that everyone told me, don't go near. So I enrolled at chef school, where we were taught various indigenous food and cooking methods, all of which were non-African, as a basis for the culinary profession. A deep hope in me still longed for proper training in African cuisine, which didn't happen, bar a few dishes that we had borrowed from our colonial past. I was further disheartened as I left cookery school to realize that the culinary hierarchy was such that it would be years before I could influence the menus, let alone decide what food left the kitchen. So I knew then that my stay at restaurant kitchen wouldn't be long. I had my work cut out for me. But unknown to me, the biggest shock really was still to come. Being born and raised on the east coast of South Africa, I naively assumed that the food we were eating at home is what every African person was eating in our country. You can imagine the culture shock I had when I was invited to showcase our food during the very first 2010 Soccer World Cup conference in Johannesburg. The majority of the locals didn't know what amadumbe are. And to my dismay, I then discovered that we actually do not know each other's food. The industry at the time did not represent the nutritious indigenous crops or the interwoven culture. I started looking into how do I get into this space and how do I disrupt it? That led me to start looking at where does our food actually come from? This sent me searching for women and youth that plow the land and understand the soil better than the rest of us. In working with the women and youth, I started learning about connecting to the root. I was then working and listening and came across a TED talk by Dr. Chika Ezianya, who advises that Africa should look at using its indigenous knowledge in order to advance, which is odd, as we often look to the West for progress. She speaks of a traditional irrigation method that far outplayed a Western irrigation method which was funded and implemented by the World Bank in Niger. So you would see this and other great ideas have come out of Africa. Now, the passion for our food and land was passed on to me unconsciously. My father left home barely a man, running away from his stepmother who was killing him with love. He left Stanger Groutville and headed for the Durban port, seeking employment as he had been told by the missionaries who had come by ship. And his ample choice of work at the time was to either be a cleaner or to cook. So he chose to cook and travel the world. We were then later spoiled to his cooking, and I enjoyed spending time with him in the kitchen as he pickled chilies and vegetables and told us about his travel tales. The other culinary great at home with green fingers is my maternal grandmother. She also left her poverty-stricken home in Umdanzane in the Eastern Cape for KwaZulu-Natal. She married a Swati national and opened up what Americans would call a diner in Pietermaritzburg. This Xhosa lady enjoyed a clientele of her husband's colleagues who were predominantly white, as he worked as the translator of the court. But she managed to run a thriving business in the thick of apartheid. We grew our own food, we made raised beds, compost, we preserved food, and through my grandmother and some of my aunts, I learned how to brew beer, umqombothi, which is traditional beer, which is knowledge that has helped me as I moved on professionally in my career. But what I noticed over time, the food had lost the taste that our tongues had long been used to historically. The land continued in all its greatness to try and grow the crops that were best suited for our region. But we were determined, armed with pesticides and artificial fertilizers, we were going to tell the land what to grow. And sadly, today, it is very easy to find bok choy in all the shops. You're hard-pressed to find imbuya, our greens in the shops, let alone our grain, which is sorghum. And recently, baobab was named a world superfruit. Now, baobab boasts 4 times more vitamin C than your average orange, and it has one of the highest ratings of antioxidants globally. It grows plentifully in our beautiful Limpopo province, but when time came for South Africa to take center stage in showing off its culinary uses, our culinary specialists could not participate, as many of them knew the baobab tree, but had no idea that this grand tree actually grows fruit, let alone what to do with the fruit. Today, you do find baobab in our health shops, but you're still hard-pressed to find it in our store shelves near our houses. So this also shows how we lose out in the food that we could showcase to the world and be experts on, which is indigenous to our land, which talks to our rich heritage, but also works with nature. But we continue the fight to work against nature. In doing this, I'm just going to ask for the guys to give you some tastings of Istanbul as we continue our conversation. What I've often heard is that African food is outdated, African food the flavor is too strong, or it just doesn't match up in presentation to other cuisines. And these are the kind of perceptions that I challenge to date. In challenging these perceptions, I started looking to my own food identity. And with time, I started working with indigenous cooks, farmers, and historians. I did my research. I started looking at how can I benefit from all of this. And in 2017, in October, I published a cookbook, which is traditional food that has been made right for our palates. And the samp that you're tasting now, the buttery taste would come from the marrow. I cook it in slow cook it in a hearty broth with marrow bone and some herbs. And that is one of my favorite tastes. Now, what you would know, there's certain flavors that stay with us over time. And one of those for me is isijingi. Now, isijingi is a Xhosa pumpkin main course meal, quite common amongst the Nguni. And for me, I was fixated with how do I bring it to the present? And I started playing around with the sweetness of the pumpkin, thickening it with far less maize than my grandmother used to use, and then complement it with honey and cinnamon. And naturally, our sugars came from berries when you looked at our ancestors. And that's the dessert that I created. The other dessert is the baobab cheesecake. People like lemony cheesecakes, but some find the lemon a bit strong. So having tasted the tanginess of the baobab, I decided to replace the lemon with the baobab. And to serve that, it is the juice of the blueberries and fresh berries, which I find that people enjoy. The other dish that goes down well is the samp that the crowd in front just tasted. As I just explained, cooked in a hearty broth, and at my cookbook launch, I decided to serve it on roasted bone marrow, which gave it quite a bitery taste. And I found that the guests were quite happy to put the cutlery aside and dig in with their fingers. And another healthy vegan dish is a vendor dish called dobi lamkusule, which was taught to me by Bolizi Pizza. And this is prepared by steaming it very lightly seasoned with salt. And after steaming, it is steaming pumpkin leaves, pumpkin flowers, imbuya, and other traditional greens. And then it gets cooked in peanut sauce. Now, if you had not known this, you would continue saying there's no vegetarian or vegan dishes in African food. And you would find that our food predominantly was vegetarian and vegan, because hunting is not easy. So they would go from time to time and hunt the eland or any other form of game, but it was not an everyday thing. And also meat was very celebratory. It was not about everyday eating meat. So the new trend of actually eating meat every day is not African. I know my African family are not gonna be chuffed with me, but that's the truth of it. It has come with time and prestige and style. So I have come to the understanding that my journey is broad. My journey is about changing people's perceptions about indigenous food and culture. And in doing that, I believe we will realize our own inherent greatness. I thank you.